Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see you here. I'm Chris Mackenzie from Penn, Melbourne, and I was thinking today, I've had civic spaces on my mind. I think we need to be worried about civic spaces sometimes and making sure that we've got them. And I was thinking, in the context of this evening's discussion, we will not be silenced. Sorry. I really want to sing the praises of three organisations who, the ones in particular that have made this event possible. Now, number one, the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas. It's a place for challenging ideas where we can come and openly test and express our ideas, and where we come together to speak out about the hard stuff. And this is a treasure in Melbourne, and I want to thank the Wheeler Centre for remaining open to all sorts of discussions. Secondly, the Copyright Council's Cultural Fund have generously supported this panel. They've enabled us to pay writers a decent fee for their work and their time, and that's really crucial. And thirdly, our beloved Penn Melbourne. Penn Melbourne is one of 140 international pen centres around the world who, for over 100 years now, have celebrated literature and campaigned for freedom of expression and writers at risk. So I'm going to introduce Prashita Shah. Prashita is a member of the Penn Melbourne Committee, and she's going to make an acknowledgement of country.
So I'd like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and to all First Nation people here with us tonight. This country has always been a place where storytelling and truth-telling has carried weight. For countless generations, First Nation people have used their voices to teach, to remember, to resist attempts at silencing and erasing them. So as we gather tonight to talk about freedom of expression, we must recognize that First Nations people have been defending this right long before these words were used in our institutions. Their persistence reminds us that speaking the truth is not just an entitlement, but a responsibility, especially when there are people in power working to quiet the loudest voices. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the treaty signing and the incredible work the country's people have fought for, making it harder for Australia's laws to infringe Aboriginal people's right to free speech and dissent, but also giving them the political powers they have been seeking to shape their futures. I would like to acknowledge the ongoing courage and the stories that will continue to guide us and challenge us on this land. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Treaty today. Well done. Now, tonight we're here, our starting off point was the International Day of the Imprisoned Writer, which actually falls on the 15th, but it's a day that Penn acknowledges every year. It's the day when we remember and support writers imprisoned for carrying out their peaceful work of reporting and exposing the wrongdoings of authorities and governments. They're our eyes and ears on the ground and in dangerous places. In the hands of courageous writers, words are acts of resistance, and for taking a stand, they are detained, incarcerated, and, in many cases, murdered. You will be all too familiar with the statistics of journalists and media workers killed in Gaza with impunity more than 240 since Israel's genocidal war began. Writers at risk, though, are not only journalists detained for reporting uncomfortable truths. The persecuted writer may and often is a poet, a songwriter, a blogger, or a novelist censored for their subversive themes, or ordinary citizens using social media. PEN International has created an archive to document the cases of Palestinian writers and poets killed in Gaza between October 2023 and September 2024. This archive ensures that the names and the works of these writers are never forgotten, as we continue to advocate for the protection of all who use their voices to inspire change. The PEN empty chair tonight is for 4 of these Palestinian writers. I think there's a slide to come. Rashad Abu Sakika. Rashad was a 23-year-old Palestinian poet and actor. He was born in Jabalia refugee camp in 2001, and he was killed on the 2nd of September 2024 by an Israeli airstrike. A graduate in media and journalism from Al-Aqsa University in Gaza, he wrote, "O writer of history, record my story, for I am buried within my sighs. O writer of history, a blooming melody, yet the flowers melt away in my sorrow. A torrent of tyranny drowns my homeland. Machines march over my remains. Alone here, bullets betrayed my rifles." Hiba Abu Nada. Hibo was a 32-year-old writer and poet and novelist killed by an Israeli airstrike on the 20th of October 2023 in southern Gaza after fleeing the extensive Israeli bombardment of northern Gaza. Inaz al-Saka was a 53-year-old Palestinian playwright, actress, and a pioneer in theatre production. On the 31st of October 2023, an Israeli airstrike killed al-Saka along with 3 of her children, Leen, Sarah, and Ibrahim, leaving 2 of her daughters critically injured. And Noor Eldin Adnan Hajjaj. Aged 27, Hajjaj, a playwright, documented his experience of war with many of his diaries published and translated by Passing Through Genocide, an initiative aimed at highlighting the work of Palestinian writers confronting the genocide in Gaza. So tonight we remember these writers and their colleagues and associates too. And so to tonight's conversation. In Australia and around the world, human rights and freedom of expression are increasingly under attack. We see the censuring, the attacks on credibility of distinguished creative people, and the dismissal of writers in Australia who broadcast their grave concerns about Israel's genocidal war on Gaza and on Palestinians. This public conversation hinges around these threats to the free expression of ideas due to increasing restrictions and silencing of those who express views considered unacceptable by agencies, institutions, and other groups in Australia. The freedom of writers to voice their concerns in the public interest is paramount. In this context, we include First Nations writers whose voices and languages have been silenced since the early days of colonisation. We are witnessing a growing polarisation of standpoints here, and the polls are active and vocal, often in ways that are not helpful for our democratic society. But alongside this, we're also experiencing an upswelling of resistance and solidarity in the face of those who would silence us. This is cause for hope in what are bleak times. Our project at Penn Melbourne is to take action. In the face of what feels like despair, we advocate for writers at risk. And so to our esteemed panel. Mary Kostakidis is a journalist and commentator with a particular interest in geopolitics, national security and foreign policy. For 2 decades, she presented SBS World News and has long been an advocate for press freedom and human rights. We remember particularly Mary's work, of course, on behalf of Julian Assange. In 2011, she joined Twitter for its capacity to break news and showcase independent journalism and perspectives absent in the mainstream media. She has used the medium to report court hearings live, including the 4-week extradition trial of Julian Assange. She is at present defending herself against what she says is a vexatious accusation of hate speech in legal proceedings brought by the Zionist Federation of Australia. Mary continues to criticise Israel's actions, which the International Court of Justice has termed genocidal. Micaela Sahar. I want to get on with this because I want to hear the panel talk. Micaela Sahar is an Australian Palestinian writer and educator living on unceded Wurundjeri country. Her essays, poetry and commentary have appeared in Cordite, Meanjin, Overland, Sydney Review of Books, among others. She is a Wheeler Centre Next Chapter Fellow, a grant recipient from the Neilma Sydney Literary Travel Fund, and was commended for the Peter Blasey Fellowship in 2024. Find Me at the Jaffa Gate, an encyclopedia of a Palestinian family, is her first book, and you'll be able to buy her book at the bookshop after this panel. Sarah Schwartz. Sarah's a human rights lawyer and the co-founding executive officer of the Jewish Council of Australia, a Jewish organisation committed to anti-racism and Palestinian human rights. She's a legal director at the Human Rights Law Centre and a lecturer at Melbourne University Law School. Susan has represented clients in the areas of police accountability, the rights of people in prison, and colonial inquests into Aboriginal deaths in custody. Sarah received a John Monash Scholarship in 2019 to study a Master of Laws at Harvard University, where she focused on racism and mass incarceration. And Daniel James. Daniel's a Yorta Yorta Melbourne-based writer and broadcaster. You will have heard him, I'm sure, on Triple R perhaps. He's the winner of the 2018 Horn Prize for his essay 10 More Days. And Daniel is the host of the 7am podcast for Schwartz Media.
Solstice Media.
Gone.
Solstice Media.
Sorry?
Solstice Media, we are, yeah.
That's
yep.
a terrible mistake.
No, it's the only one I know.
Well, I think, anyway, we won't go there. Thank you. And a contributor to the Saturday paper. Indigenous X, SBS, Crikey, The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, and The Guardian. Daniel's work explores notions of empathy, intergenerational trauma, hidden history, and the political landscape that continues to shape the lives of Aboriginal people across the country. And most recently, Daniel was the lead writer for the Yurok Justice Commission's final report, Truth Be Told. That's available online as a digital object. Daniel has a long view of the silencing of First Nations people, and he'll guide tonight's conversation for us, and he'll guide it around what it means to be silenced, to resist silences, and we'll also hear from him about his own experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome one and all. I should start by saying that there will be 15 minutes of audience questions on a thing called Slido. So instead of someone running around with a microphone trying to get people to ask questions, there is a code that you can scan that will go to the Wheeler Centre and appear on this device here, and I will read it out. And also noting that we need to get you out of here, Mary, at 7:30 on the dot. So if you see her heading that direction at a rate of knots, please stand over because she needs to get to the airport. So we're very thankful for you being here tonight, Mary. Tonight's event, we will not be silenced. It's part of the Penn's Melbourne Day of the Imprisoned Writer, a moment to recognise those around the world and here at home who face persecution for speaking or writing truthfully. I was basically drawing a short straw or a long straw while we were being introduced there to think of who to ask this first question to. And you got the short straw, Micaela. How would you define this moment in time when it comes to the freedom of ideas, the dangers of expressing ideas, and the consequences of expressing those ideas? What sort of time are we living in?
Oh, just ask a simple one to get us started.
Short straw.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, this has been, I think, for probably many people in the audience, or you probably wouldn't be here, what we have watched over the last 2 years is the nadir of human experience, certainly of the 20th century. I mean, that we can watch a live stream genocide and still debate whether or not what we're watching is or is not a genocide speaks to the parlous state, I think, of institutions in the Anglosphere and the Western world at this moment. And I suppose to answer, what are we watching right now, I have to think back a little bit and think about the way that Palestine has been thought about and spoken about over 8 decades, since before 1948. There's quite a good book by a journalist historian, Peter Manning, who works on the Sydney Morning Herald's coverage of the Nakba, and he concludes that the Sydney Morning Herald missed the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, for those who don't know. A scholar in the States, a Palestinian scholar in the States, looked at media coverage of events concerning Palestinian people in American newspapers since 1948 up until a couple of years ago. And in the best newspaper, in each decade, Palestinian voices accounted for about 3% of the material on events concerning Palestinian people. That's in the best paper, but most of the time it was under 2%. During a genocide, the Centre for Media Reporting found that the BBC offers the Israeli perspective 11 times more frequently than the Palestinian perspective, which is a staggering 2,300 and something times compared to 200 times. So it kind of gives you a sense of the moment we're in, which is a very long moment if you're a Palestinian person, or for that matter, people from other minority groups, First Nations people have experienced similar things, but I won't speak to that. So I think we have to ask ourselves, right? The problem isn't that Palestinian people don't have a voice. Of course we do. What we don't have is a platform. And the people who offer us platforms consistently, to be honest with you, are First Nations communities, marginalised communities, minority communities. Instead, we have seen employers and institutions who are much less concerned about the lives of Palestinian people, and to the contrary, they've been very concerned about the feelings of a small group of the population who I think are often acting in quite bad faith. And so to give you an example, in my book, there's a chapter on a bombing, which is the reason, in a very immediate sense, why my family leave Jerusalem in 1948. It's the bombing of the Semiramis Hotel. And this is a massacre that kills several dozen Palestinian people and is a huge catalyst to the depopulation of Arab Jerusalem, or Palestinian Arab Jerusalem. And because of the University Australia definition, which was unrolled, unfortunately, in the week that my book was going to press, this caused all sorts of problems with my publisher, who were, I have to say, an excellent publisher and very supportive, but they were nervous because they're also a university publisher. They also asked me to put in things like, in a particular chapter where I'm talking about the behaviour of Zionists, they said, would you consider putting in the early Zionists? It's like there's no difference to me. In fact, if anything, the later Zionists are worse. Look at what they're doing now. The early Zionists were at least honest. They called themselves terrorists and they recognised that Palestinian people were the indigenous people of their land. I think I've gone awfully off topic, but I hope it might have, hit some of
Well, one of the things that you raised, which I think I'll go to Mary about, is in terms of elevating voices. You're a seasoned veteran working in the media, and I'm sure you would have all sorts of stories about who is heard and who isn't heard, and who decides who is heard. From your vast and esteemed experience, what would you say to that in terms of who decides gets platformed, and then who decides who gets torn down, as we're seeing across the Western world at the moment? What are your experiences and thoughts in relation to that?
Okay. Well, the mainstream media, unfortunately, and this is why people are turning to social media, and by social media, for me, social media really is civic media. It's where you're going to find a more democratic form of the sharing of knowledge. In the mainstream media, there are, I think, two reasons why we've had this very long moment for the Palestinians. One has to do with very successful lobbying from the Israeli lobby, the Zionist community, which has been extremely effective. They have a number of organisations. It's a small community. These are self-appointed people, but they have titles: CEO, board director. They have business cards. They appear in suits, and they have letterheads, and the doors of managing directors and boardrooms are open to them, and they always have been. They flood media organisations with complaints. I mean, Andrew Olley said to the head of SBS when she went in to be interviewed about, viewer feedback, and after the interview, he said to her, "Look, we just, think long and hard before we run a story about Israel-Palestine, and we think long and hard before we, just as SBS had to do, buy a documentary that showed the Palestinian perspective, because you have to consider, do you have the time that's going to be required to respond to the flood of complaints about it?" Now, when we started up SBS, communities did complain on the basis that, well, you're not showing Greece or Spain or Italy or whichever country in a positive light. But no one complained. No community complained, and no community had the sort of clout and access that the Israeli lobby had. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect has to do simply with the lens through which we look at this. And it's the lens of the global north. Now, I don't come from the global north originally, my family culture. So coming into the SBS newsroom, I really was a bit of a Martian because my family come from the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, from the south coast of the Black Sea, and they were multiracial communities. You know, there were Armenians, Arabs, Greeks, Christians, Muslims, and when they left as refugees after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, went to Greece, they were not desirable. Then they migrated here. But when they left the Ottoman Empire and took with them a culture to Greece that then, you know, became very cool eventually, but it was the bouzouki, the cuisine. Rosa Eskenazi went with them. You know, she sang the songs of Constantinople. And even in Australia, and my father was born in Greece, but it was his family culture. If there's something wrong with you and the doctor can't, you know, work out what it is, and your priest can't resolve it, well, you were taken to an imam, because there was this mutual respect. There was a celebration of each other's festive days. There was a respect of each other's religions. Those things were extremely important and an integral part of that multiracial society. But that's not the way have operated here. And you see that in response to our history of our Indigenous people. And what did we do to try and fix that? We talked about a voice. What we need is a treaty. And no one's had the courage to say, look, Canada have a treaty, the US has a treaty, New Zealand has a treaty. What are we so frightened about? That's another matter. But the lens of, you know, we talk about this holy grail of impartiality, balance, neutrality, and what's the fourth one? Now I've forgotten.
The vibe.
Pardon?
The vibe?
Anyway, all these, you know, our code of conduct, the holy grail. Well, we transgress all of that because we're not. We haven't given Palestinian voices, and I can tell you why. Because when I would say, look, we're crossing to Mark Regev constantly for updates, right? As if it's some neutral party. Why don't we have a Palestinian on for a change? And the response that I got from the chief producer on the night was, what for? They're all mad. And this is at SBS. But you see, what works is that the journalists would go backwards and forwards to Israel. So when you go to Israel, the only Palestinians you meet would be ones that were approved by Israel. You don't go to Gaza, you don't go to the West Bank, you don't go to East Jerusalem. So not all journalists come back, you know, with their views skewed. But many can't help being affected. And these people are in positions where they make decisions about what we're allowed to know, who we're allowed to hear. And the silencing in this moment in history, to go to your first question, silencing speech is nothing new. But this is a very dangerous moment because it's the first time ever that there is a campaign to silence throughout the Western world, Western democracies. This has never happened before. This is extremely dangerous, and it is why every single one of us has to resist it. If it's successful for Israel, it won't stop there. We will soon not be able to criticise other countries. We won't be able to criticise American foreign policy.
And, you know, neutrality is really a myth, right? Like, neutrality is in itself a position to take. And this is what Palestinian people are up against all the time. And it's quite extraordinary that you can have the genocidaires commenting on their own genocide. I mean, when did that ever happen before? It's extraordinary. Certainly not on the news, yeah.
Yeah, that is the problem. The problem for the mainstream media now is that it's too late. People can't unsee what they've seen. They haven't shown it. They haven't even described it. We have seen children with their intestines hanging out, with their legs being chopped off, with their beheaded, just a torso of a child, or half their face blown off.
But it's amazing.
Those things aren't described, Micaela.
No, they're not. But I think it's, I mean, you know, you're talking about the importance of social media, and I really agree with you. But I think it's amazing we've even managed to see that. And, you know, I'm thinking about Anthony Lowenstein writes in his book, The Palestine Laboratory, that during the Russian invasion, Meta put out a policy to preserve Ukrainian voice. So if Ukrainians wanted to say things like death to the Russian invaders, it was understood that because they were being invaded, they would naturally have some feelings about that. But in contrast, you know, this year, there was a Meta policy that was leaked, which was to suppress all reference to the Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani, who was assassinated by Mossad in 1972 and who writes about the literature of the resistance, because even 50 years later, his ideas are too powerful to be circulated online. I mean, it's extraordinary. So that, you know, that Ghassan and all of the extraordinary Palestinian journalists, that we know their names, that we hear their stories, it's their tenacity. It's not even those platforms. I mean, YouTube has just removed a huge repository of data of the genocide. I mean, and this keeps happening. And I know that, you know, you and others are very busy keeping the receipts on all this stuff.
Well, the problem is, you know, that it's anti-Semitic today, apparently, to talk about Mossad. It's anti-Semitic to talk about, you know, it's fine for Israel, it's fine for the Likud party to say in their platform that sovereignty only for the Jewish people from the river to the sea. That's okay. That's okay. Why aren't the media telling the Australian public that this is something that Israelis say? It's enshrined in Israeli law now since 2018. Why is it that we are told by whoever it was it Dennis Richardson or Burgess, I can't recall, that from the river to the sea is a dangerous, it's violent, it's dangerous and violent, and no journalist will challenge them.
I might just bring Sarah in here. You're sitting there looking pretty. You've clearly got a lot of skin in the game here in this town, in this country. And I've seen pretty up close the sort of the attacks that you've been under, the attempted silencing of you and your colleagues and people across your community as well. How do you keep going when the pressure to stay silent is so strong?
I mean, I'm in it now, so it's too late for me to go back into the cave. No, but seriously, I think I mean that in a broader sense, in that on this issue, when you come, as I do, and I think a lot of other Jewish people do, from a world in which you're not allowed to ask certain questions, where you're not taught about the Nakba, where you're taught about your own identity and history through a particular political lens, where you don't have access to Palestinian perspectives. When you do start getting access to those perspectives, when you do learn, and when you do finally start asking those questions, it is very hard to go back into the box. And I have seen in this moment, and what really keeps me going is the number of Jewish people who contact me and others almost daily who are going through the same journeys. You know, I grew up hearing stories of people like Anthony Lowenstein, who had written My Israel Question in 2006. And the stories that Anthony speaks about in that book, it could have been written today. It speaks about his trials and tribulations with the Israel lobby, asking questions about Israel. You know, meanwhile, when he wrote that book, he didn't even have the politics that he has today. But still, at that time, I remember seeing hit piece after hit piece after hit piece in the Australian Jewish News, in a range of other publications. I don't think we had the sort of smear machine that we have today. But I still remember that sort of silencing that he had to face for his work. And it's those sorts of stories. And I think in some ways, to some people, my voice has become a similar voice. That this attempt to smear me and other people like me is sent as a warning shot. I think, Mary's situation, I think what's happened to Randa Abdel Fattah, I think there are people that get picked up for whatever reason and to be tried to make an example of. And I sort of think about this, I've been thinking a lot about this, like what Mary spoke about, the complaints process and the sort of anatomy of the smear campaigns against anyone who speaks out on Palestine in this moment. The way in which there are these sort of, the way in which institutions so easily crumble. And we see it, we've seen it, there are countless examples of a letter that gets sent from an organisation which has a vaguely official sounding name. Sometimes they're an organisation that has just been created, followed by, saying that a certain speaker is liable to make people feel unsafe, saying that a certain speaker will, raise controversial issues, raising sort of the spectre of anti-Semitism, which, mind you, I find extremely offensive as a Jewish person to claim that people speaking out on issues of historical truth, that represents a form of racism against Jewish people. I think, what does that say about Jewish people? That we could not handle that form of speech. I think that in itself is quite a racist idea. But yeah, we have these sort of these letters, and then we have one letter, then we have hundreds of letters, and they might all be exactly the same, but we don't seem to have institutions in this country that are capable of facing the power that we're up against. And I hear everything that Micaela and Mary have said about this current moment, and I agree with it in regard to this current moment, but I also think a lot about how we are talking about here a situation of grave injustice and genocide, and in every genocide and situation of grave injustice, there has always been a silencing of the oppressed group. And when you think of this country and the silencing of First Nations peoples who...
I might step in here.
Yeah,
if that's
please
okay.
step in.
Well, we were talking backstage about how silence itself can become the narrative, and we've experienced that here in this country through what we call the Great Australian Silence, and what happened at the hands of colonialists to First Nations people. I've just finished writing, working with the team to write Truth Be Told, the Europe Justice Commission report. And all the information's there. Like, all the information that I needed to sort of draft the work was there. There was historical record, there was first-person testimony, there was ancestral testimony. But in terms of that becoming part of the national conversation and part of our national identity, for better or worse, I like to think that we're mature enough to deal with these things. The referendum on The Voice showed that that is not the case. the amount of violence, and I don't mean it in sort of physical violence, but the amount of emotional, intellectual violence that was thrust against people advocating the voice, First Nations people, is something we still haven't really sort of reckoned with yet. We haven't had a conversation about that properly. And there will be opportunities to do that, I hope so. I hope treaty, signed today just by coincidence, I didn't organise it, will start those conversations. I was reflecting yesterday, I was very fortunate enough to be invited to the signing of the treaty by the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria on the banks of Birrarung. And I was just reflecting on the time and the moment and how much history there is around us. 250 metres upstream is Yarra Bank, which was known as Speaker's Corner as well. Members of the Australian Aborigines League in the 1930s would go there on a regular basis and talk about the plight of their people and try to be heard on matters of land justice, social justice, and the basic treatment of Aboriginal people. 3 kilometres upriver was where the Faux Treaty was first signed between Batman and the Wurundjeri people. And then further upstream, we had Barak come off his land to walk to Melbourne and protest the treatment of his people at Corandurk. And if I want to add this sort of slither of hope in terms of what we can do in terms of breaking the silence, is that because of treaty, the story of the Aborigines Advancement League at Speaker's Corner, the deception that was the Faux Treaty at the intersection of Mary Creek and Birrarung, and the plight of the people of Corandurk and Barak and his people will all be known to school children coming up because it's going to be taught in the curriculum because of treaty. That's one way we can cut through it. And First Nations people have led the way on that. It's a tremendously proud moment for everyone involved. But there has been a price, and we've lost many a good people along the way. A lot of people have been ostracised. A lot of people have been seen as terrorists. A lot of people have been seen as radicals. And there has been, I don't think you'd even call it censorship because the doors haven't even been opened to a lot of Indigenous voices. Places like this, the Wheeler Centre, have done a magnificent job at doing that. I think we're living in a golden age of First Nation storytelling at the moment. You go to any bookshop now, you shake a bookshelf and an Indigenous book will fall off. But it doesn't diminish the moment that we are in, and we can't take anything for granted because as a writer myself and as media people, as advocates, as fellow writers, it just feels like a tremendously dangerous time to express anything. Well, besides, blogging about your dinner. It's just, I wonder if anyone has any sort of reflections on how thwart do you feel in terms of speaking up and the potential backlash that will come?
Oh, go on. You go.
No, it's a dangerous time for some people to be speaking out. It's a dangerous time to speak out against power and certain types of power, but it has not been dangerous for people speaking in favour of power, and this is where this neutrality comes in. It's not necessarily a dangerous time to be speaking under the guise of what what mainstream media determines is neutrality. It's only dangerous to be challenging that in this moment. So, but yet there are so many people who are risking everything to speak out. And I think the fact that this moment has seen in regard to Palestine, the fact that this genocide, as Mary has said, has been live streamed and we have seen it and we have seen the bodies. I think that places us in a very unique moment and has meant that we can see the end result of people speaking up and being slaughtered for it in Gaza. And it has compelled so many people to continue to speak up despite the consequences.
I mean, given all this, you can say whatever you want, of course, Micaela, but when it comes to journalism, and we've spoken about journalism and sort of editorial standards to a certain extent this evening, how do we go about rebuilding trust in journalism in a sort of post-truth environment?
I want to go back a little bit there and just think about the fact that I think in the last 2 years the Australian media has actually got worse. Mm-hmm. So I think in other parts of the world the media's got a little bit better. I think the Guardian UK's got a bit better over many years, and actually some of my research work is on media narrative. They've improved over several decades. Here, actually, you know, there's this idea that if Palestinians get to speak, they only get to speak on human interest stories. Early in the genocide, we would get, I say we, I mean the Palestinian community, we would get requests to be connected with, you know, a Palestinian, you know, in Gaza whose family had been displaced, and, you know, often this wasn't possible, and increasingly the community were unwilling to have these interactions because it really felt like the vultures were descending. And you look at it and you think there are plenty of Palestinian people who are able to talk about, for example, the history of Palestine, Palestinian representation, and I count myself among that. We were not asked, even when they couldn't get Palestinian people to speak because there were blackouts imposed by Israel in Gaza. You know, and then very early on in the genocide, and I think this has really determined the direction of the ABC as highlighted by David Marr in recent radio programs. There was and this is quite personal to me because a friend who runs a organisation in Gaza had arranged for the ABC for a story to be made with a Palestinian photojournalist who was then killed by Israel, Mr. Roshdi Siraj. Now, he was killed in an Israeli airstrike and he was walking downstairs and his wife was in front of him, and next thing she had his brains in her hands, right? The ABC would not mention the manner of his death, even though he was an employee of theirs. And then they made some argument that in fact he was a contractor and not actually an employee, right? To follow it up, a Palestinian artist whose artwork I'm also wearing on my T-shirt, Sophia Sabag, she and many others illustrated the Palestinian journalists who had been murdered up until that time in December 2023, put them on the walls of the ABC, and they were summarily torn down by the ABC, who didn't even report the fact that the images had gone up. So I think it tells, you know, and that's the outlet that you might expect to do a bit better job than some of the sort of, you know, bigger media interests, and that's what the ABC has done.
We're approaching sort of like 12 minutes to go. There are a whole raft of questions here. But before we move on, Mary, I want to ask you the question, how do we restore trust in journalism? And if you could be brief so we can get to some of these deadly questions, that'd be great.
Well, we recently had a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist here, Chris Lynn Hedges, and he was to speak at the National Press Club precisely about this issue, and he was cancelled. Now, if the category of people who are charged with holding power to account won't broker any self-examination, then how can we have faith in their capacity to do their jobs? It's unfortunate that it was cancelled because it may have just been a trigger to start that conversation. There's no appetite for that conversation, and I think the mainstream media really are they are isolating themselves. I think what will happen is, especially now, because of the genocide, more and more people will look to social media because that is where independent journalists spruik their work. That's how we find out. It's where news breaks. It's where you hear the perspectives that the New York Times no longer is interested in, the Washington Post, the London Times.
It's also a place where you will cop a torrent of abuse. And
Yes,
very personal abuse.
Yep, water off a duck's back.
But it's not water off duck's back for
I
everyone.
couldn't look. This whole issue.
We saw that during the referendum.
Sorry.
It's not water off a duck's back for everyone. We saw that during the referendum.
No,
There are some people
sorry, I beg
still
your pardon. I
sort
thought
of
you were talking about
recovering from the
yep.
abuse that they copped
Yep.
by putting a simple proposition to the Australian people. So there are swings and roundabouts with it.
Sorry, what are you saying about social media, that it's also toxic?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Particularly
Absolutely.
X at the moment.
Yes, and you don't have to engage with that. I mean, the way, because for me it's such a useful working tool, I simply don't engage with it. If you're sensitive and it's going to affect you, well then, don't be on it. What can I say? But for me, it's really it gives you an opportunity to make global connections. That global connectivity is supremely important, because now people like John Mearsheimer, people like Jeffrey Sachs, they're not platformed at all because their messages are unpopular. Their analysis is considered, dangerous, right? So that's where you find them, and that's what drew me to social media. I think I'm not very hopeful about the mainstream media. Look at what happened. They used Elon Musk as an excuse. Oh, we're leaving because, Elon Musk has bought Twitter. No, I don't think that's why they left. I think they left because people reply. You don't just make pronouncements like I used to do in the news. I announce such and such. You can't talk back to me. You can try. You can, complain to SBS. I knew that there are people in our audience that knew about our stories, knew a lot more about our stories. It's just, I really don't think the mainstream media have really got it. People have woken up. They've realised that, the right, it's not just about the right to speak, which is what our panel's about. It's also about the right to know. It's our right to know.
Well, we have an interesting question here from Paul in the audience, and it's silencing is transparency is a huge part of silencing, and a huge part of the way our democracy functions. And so Paul has asked, what are the likely implications of Labor successfully passing its FOI law on free speech and citizen rights to information? I mean, we have every government that comes into power who campaign on, we're going to be transparent, we're going to have open government, but it seems to me like the nature of government itself and the nature of governing itself turns everyone to the same sort of closed shop sort of attitude. Sarah, do you have any sort of thoughts? You're looking at me knowingly.
I mean, I guess I've had a lot of dealings with the FOI system and troubles in the FOI system, as you might have had. And I think this is one of the ways in which we're deprived of public information, really. Like, our FOI system at present is not set up to be a system where the public is provided with information readily accessible about how our government operates and how institutions operate. So we're always on the back foot. And I think when it comes to like what we're talking about with trust in the media, we have seen, and we saw this through Antoinette's Lattouf's court case. We saw this through Khaled Sabsabi's the decisions making of Creative Australia. That a lot of this comes down to the fact that that there are sort of complaints going in one direction, institutions not providing the people impacted with any sort of response or due process or access to information. The Murdoch press, which we haven't spoken about, having a huge amount of power in Australia's media landscape, despite the fact that I don't think that they have very high readership numbers. Regardless, they are setting the tone for our political sphere. And when media articles came out, and I saw this firsthand, in my case, media articles came out in the Murdoch press. I didn't have access to the same level of information as what the Murdoch press had been provided.
Yeah.
I didn't have access to the same level of information that the institutions had been provided with. But on the basis of the information that was in the Murdoch press, institutions immediately shut down. In my case, QUT. Immediately, the Vice-Chancellor felt like she had to issue an apology. We saw it with Bendigo Writers Festival, where complaints are made behind closed doors. The Murdoch press runs series of articles. There's the spectre, actually, in that case. There was the spectre of articles in the Murdoch press because they had a history of vilifying Rwanda. And then the institutions immediately respond in a way. And so I know that this is sort of a bit separate to the FOI question, because of course this new bill is about, in some aspects of the bill are about making it harder for people to make anonymised FOI requests and request this information anonymously. But I think what we're talking about really here is this complete imbalance of information and an imbalance of institutional power. And we don't have institutions that have a robustness to say, we can just ignore the Murdoch press. I don't, and we can ignore, I think that some of this also does happen on social media, the spread of these sorts of vilification campaigns. And in my case, it was sort of spread on social media before it got into the Murdoch press. And so there is a two-way stream here. And we don't have platforms of truth. We don't have an FOI system that can immediately tell you what the actual factual scenario that has happened, what has actually happened. And so we're operating with this complete imbalance of power where I don't think that there is any space. I don't know if we have that civic space anymore. I don't think that we have it within the mainstream media, and I'm not sure that we have it on social media either. I think it's lacking.
But something I think is quite important to remember about the Lattouf case you brought up, because this was widely publicised, but maybe it's a very shocking thing happened. Antoinette lost her job as a result of a concerted letter writing campaign, right? Which was coordinated through a chap that was leaked during the Fair Work Commission hearings. Except when that was leaked, the only action that was taken was very quickly to put through doxing legislation because it had exposed the people who enabled the sacking to take place in the first place. So there was no protection for the person who lost their job. There was protection for the people who had gone after the person who lost their job. It's extraordinary, and it tells you where the power is.
In the 3 minutes left, all three of you, if you could answer this question. It's a very simple question, and it may seem like an absurd question given what we've been talking about, but is there hope? Is this paradigm that we're in a permanent thing? Is this disbalance in information a permanent thing? Is the silence or the threats to silence a permanent thing, or are we just going through a period of history that we as a collective need to work our way through to get to the other side?
I don't want it to be a permanent thing. I don't think any of us want it to be a permanent thing. And that's why it's so important that we all speak up. And it may be dangerous for those of us that have been chosen, but I have to say my mind goes to Julian Assange when he spoke up and when he published what he published. He was alone, and he paid an incredible price. I'm just being taken to court. It's rooted my life, but I'm not in jail. I'm not in solitary confinement. So you have to see things in perspective. I'm also not being killed. My grandchildren aren't being killed. So we have to think of the position of people that are actually paying a far greater price. This is all about our common humanity. That's what it's about. It's about everybody's right to be free and to live with dignity and equality. This is what the Palestinian people have wanted. This is what they've wanted. And I think the positive side of the positive in all of this is that we all now realise, and we're not going to unrealise that.
Micaela?
I don't think it's just about speaking up, actually. I think it's also about listening and believing the oppressed, believing victims. And, you know, a really powerful thing that happened a couple of weeks into the genocide in October 2023 was that a collective called the Red Nation published a solidarity letter with Palestinian people. So lots of Turtle Island, artists and scholars and First Nations mob from here as well signed on. And they understood that whatever happened in October was part of 77 years of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And it's exactly what Palestinian people have said all along. And, you know, I think we have to ask ourselves why, when the Palestinian people have said that they've suffered from, apartheid, for instance, for decades, why is it that only an Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, in 2021 is the group that other groups start listening to? We really have to think about the internalised racism, I think, you know, across the board that disallows us from listening to the people who know what they're talking about. Yeah.
Mary, I just wanted to let you know it's 7:30, so if you have to rush off, by all means.
Yeah, can I give my apologies? The only reason I have to catch a flight home is because I'm in the middle of preparing my defence. It's due,
Bit
so
ironic.
I have a deadline.
Please thank Mary
Thank you.
Kostakidis. Thank you, Mary. Sarah. Final word to you, Sarah.
I was recently in the UK, and I was with a Palestinian friend, and we went and watched some of the protests that for older people who were being arrested for holding signs that said, "I support genocide."
So they should be arrested.
That would be the appropriate course of action. You would think, but no, you don't get arrested for that. Actually,
Oh, right.
no, you get arrested for saying, "I oppose genocide. I support Palestine Action," a protest group who has been engaging in acts of civic disobedience following a long line of civic disobedience, including attacks on military facilities who have been involved in the genocide and have been involved in the military trade with Israel. And I think watching 80, 90-year-olds who were sitting silently, holding signs, and some of whom were in wheelchairs and had to be carried off by police, sitting side by side with Palestinians, sitting side by side with protesters, and the absolute, watching them get arrested willingly by the police, and continuing to speak out. I think that those acts of solidarity, the fact that people are still willing to put their bodies on the line, and the fact that Palestinians are still putting their bodies on the line, means that in some ways it's not a question of hope, but a question of necessity, that we have to keep going because we're not left with any other choice.
Very well put. And I will close by saying, as a member of a community where genocide was committed, and it was found to be the case in Uruk after forensic evidence and testimony was provided and analysed and put together, the events of today, the events of yesterday, tell me that there is hope. but it also tells me that it's an incredibly hard, long road, and one thing you don't do is give up. So let's finish with that. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming out. Lovely group of people.